rapid industrialization, deep social reform, and an unprecedented expansion of the British Empire, all hallmarks of the revolutionary Victorian era, which its namesake, Queen Victoria, presided over as monarch of the United Kingdom from 1837 until her death in 1901. While establishing strong domestic moral standards, her leadership propelled Britain to the position of preeminence in global power, altering the course of international trade, culture, and politics through its imperial influence. But the intricacies of colonial rule and the rigid social mores of the time cast a shadow over her reign. Regardless, the impact she had on contemporary innovation, global affairs, and governance is one that can never really be denied. So here we are today to talk all about Queen Victoria. Take a seat and relax, and if you like, well, click the subscribe button. You've got nothing to lose. So let's start first with the family background of Queen Victoria. Of course, we're not going to be referring to her as Queen Victoria throughout the whole talk, only until her coronation when we'll be using other naming conventions. We have Prince Edward, the Duke of Kent and Strathearn, the fourth son of King George III, and Queen Charlotte. That was the father of Victoria. Now, until 1817, Edward's niece, Princess Charlotte of Wales, that is the daughter of George, Prince Regent, who actually later became George IV, was King George's only legitimate grandchild. Her death in 1817 sparked a crisis in the line of succession, prompting Prince Edward and his still unmarried brothers to quickly have children and get married. Or rather, get married and have children. That is the general course of events at that time. In 1818, Edward married Princess Victoria of Saxe-Coburg Saalfeld, a widowed German princess, who actually already had 2 children of her own, that being the firstborn Karl, who was born in 1804, and Feodora, who was born in 1807. This was from her first marriage to Emich Karl II, Prince of Leiningen. Princess Victoria's brother, Leopold, went on to become Belgium's first king, and was once Princess Charlotte's widower. The Duke and Duchess of Kent's only child, Victoria, was born on Monday, May 24th, 1819, at 4:15 a.m. in Kensington Palace, London. And thus the story truly begins at the dawn of that new day. June 24th, 1819 was the date of Victoria's baptism in a private ceremony in Kensington's Palace Cupola Room by Charles Manners Southern, the Archbishop of Canterbury. She received the name Victoria for her mother, and Alexandrina in honor of Tsar Alexander I of Russia, who was actually one of her godparents. There is a little bit of interrelation between the Russian royal families, before the Bolsheviks took them all out, and the English royal families. We'll probably get to that in my video I'll do on Frederick at a later date. It is coming. So, under orders from the Prince Regent, the other names her parents had proposed, so Georgina or Georgiana, Charlotte, and Augusta, were dismissed. I would have chosen Augusta. That sounds like a good one. Victoria was 5th in the line of succession at birth after George III's 4 elder sons. Her father, Edward, Duke of Kent, Frederick, Duke of York, William, Duke of Clarence, later William IV, and George, Prince Regent, later George IV. Since the 2 oldest brothers, George and Frederick, were estranged from their wives, who were past childbearing age, by the way, and had no surviving children, they were unlikely to produce future heirs. In a joint ceremony in 1818, Edward and William both married, although William's two legitimate daughters died as infants, which is a shame, pretty common at the time. Best doctors available, notwithstanding, the royal family still had the same problems as others when it came to infant mortality. They just hadn't quite figured it out yet. So on March 27, 1819, Princess Charlotte was born and then soon passed away, just 2 months before Victoria's own birth. Victoria then lost her father in January of 1820, when she was still under a year old. As for her grandfather, he died a week later, and his eldest son became George V, the fourth rather, moving Victoria to third in line after Frederick and William. From December 10th, 1820, until March 4th, 1821, she was fourth in line, while William's second daughter, Princess Elizabeth, lived but briefly. When Prince Frederick died in 1827, and George IV followed in 1830, Victoria became the presumed heir. Their surviving brother William IV assumed the throne under the Regency Act of 1830. If William were to die while Victoria was still a minor, her mother would act as regent. However, in 1836, King William openly questioned the Duchess's suitability for that role and declared, in her presence, his wish to survive until Victoria turned 18, thereby avoiding regency completely. Later in life, Victoria described her childhood as rather melancholy. She kept quite a detailed journal, by the way. Do you imagine if I took on the project of doing a full reading of her journal? Perhaps I should. I don't think anybody else has yet. Well, central to this was the Kensington system. Now, what exactly was the Kensington system? Well, you know, those manners and means in which a royal must conduct themselves. Well, that was basically it. It was a strict arrangement of protocols and rules designed by her mother, the Duchess, in collaboration with her ambitious and controlling Sir John Conroy, who was rumoured to be the Duchess's lover. Raised primarily apart from other children, Victoria was kept under her mother's intense protection. The system aimed to keep her frail and dependent on both the Duchess and Conroy by restricting contact with those they deemed unsuitable. And this, by the way, did include a lot of her paternal family. The Duchess, appalled by the presence of King William's illegitimate offspring, avoided the royal court entirely. Victoria's education, of course, followed a strict schedule with private tutors. She shared her mother's bedroom nightly and spent her free time playing with dolls and her King Charles spaniel, whose name was Dash, by the way. While English was spoken at home, of course, she also studied French, Italian, German, and Latin, and apparently she got quite good at them. In 1830, the Duchess and Conroy travelled with Victoria through the heart of England, stopping at various towns and grand country estates to visit the Malvern Hills. Similar tours followed in 1832, 33, 34, and 35, covering further parts of England and Wales. At each stop, Victoria was warmly welcomed, and King William did not really take kindly to this. He was not as warmly welcomed as she was, unfortunately. Concerned at these excursions, portraying Victoria as a rival rather than his heir, he equated them with royal progressions. The princess herself seemed to dislike the journeys. She often felt exhausted and ill from the numerous public events, leaving little time to recuperate. The schedule was just way too heavy for her. I somehow think of the scene in the opening scene of Roman Holiday, where Audrey Hepburn is read out a ridiculous schedule and she has a breakdown and they have to call the doctor. Remember, you must have some sympathy for the manner in which these people are forced to conduct themselves. It's no wonder some of the royals choose to simply leave. Well, she objected to all of this, of course, and she pointed out the king's disapproval, but her mother dismissed the king's complaints as jealousy and insisted that Victoria continue with the harsh schedule, regardless of what the king thought of it, and regardless of what Victoria herself thought about it. Bad luck. Back to work, Your Majesty. In October 1835 at Ramsgate, Victoria developed a high fever that Conroy initially dismissed as childish play acting, thought that she was faking the whole thing. But while she was unwell, Conroy and the Duchess tried unsuccessfully to have Victoria name Conroy as her private secretary. Even as a teenager, she steadfastly resisted their attempts to include him on her staff. Although the Queen later banished him from her immediate circle, Conroy did remain in her mother's household. By 1836, Victoria's maternal uncle Leopold, who had been King of the Belgians since 1831, wished for her to marry Prince Albert, the son of his brother Ernest I, Duke of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. To facilitate their meeting, Leopold arranged for Victoria's mother to host their Coburg relatives in May of 1836. King William IV, however, favoured Prince Alexander of the Netherlands, second son of the Prince of Orange, and opposed any Coburg alliance. He simply was not having it. A succession of prospective suitors was then paraded before Victoria, who evaluated them all with keen awareness of these competing marital schemes. Her diary attests that she took an immediate liking to Albert, where she had judged Alexander to be very plain. Poor Alexander. Bad luck, I suppose, mate. Well, after Albert's visit, she wrote in her diary, Albert is extremely handsome. His hair is about the same color as mine, his eyes are large and blue, and he has a beautiful nose and a very sweet mouth with fine teeth. But the charm of his countenance is his expression, which is most delightful. Yes, she's completely head over heels for Albert, it seems. Though she found Albert to be appealing, Victoria, who was only 17 at the time, still felt too young for marriage. She wrote to King Leopold, who she deemed her best and kindest adviser, thanking him for the prospect of great happiness you have contributed to give me in the person of dear Albert. She went on to say, he possesses every quality that could be desired to render me perfectly happy. He is so sensible, so kind, and so good and so amiable too. He has besides the most pleasing and delightful exterior and appearance you could possibly see. Rather than sealing a formal engagement at the time, both families assumed that the union would occur eventually. 17 is a little bit too young to get married. Enjoy your life a little. On May 24th, 1837, upon reaching the age of 18, Victoria no longer required a regency. Less than a month later, on June 20th, 1837, she ascended the throne as the Queen of the United Kingdom, following the death of William IV at age 71. And what good timing! Just as she turns 18, she can go straight into the role. No regency required. Crown on the head, sit on the throne. Let's get busy. She actually recorded the moment in her diary. I'll read the passage. I got out of bed and went into my sitting room, only in my dressing gown, and alone saw them. Lord Conyngham then acquainted me with my poor uncle, and said that the king my poor uncle, the king was no more, and had expired at 12 minutes past 2 this morning, and consequently that I am queen. Although Britain and the German territory of Hanover had shared a ruler since 1714, Hanover adhered to Salic law, which barred women from succeeding to its throne. Consequently, Victoria inherited the British crown, while her unpopular paternal uncle, Ernest Augustus, Duke of Cumberland, became King of Hanover. Until Victoria had children, Ernest Augustus was seen as her presumptive heir. When Victoria succeeded, the government was led by the Whig Prime Minister, Lord Melbourne, who quickly became her primary advisor, offering guidance to the young and politically inexperienced Queen. She likely saw him as kind of like a father figure. The chronicler Charles Greville speculated that the widowed and childless Melbourne cared for her as he would care for his own daughter, took her under the wing, helped her out, and of course probably kept her safe from a lot of those dirty politics of the court. Victoria's coronation took place June 28, 1838 at Westminster Abbey, where more than 400,000 visitors came to London to celebrate. She not only gained revenue from the duchies of Lancaster and Cornwall, but also received an annual civil list income of £385,000. With her own frugality, she paid off her late father's debts and became the first monarch to make Buckingham Palace her primary residence. There's the trivia question for you. Victoria, the first monarch to have Buckingham Palace as a primary residence. Remember that one. Well, initially, Victoria was well received by the public, but it wasn't long until a scandal came forth. Her reputation suffered in 1839 because of the scandals surrounding Lady Flora Hastings, one of her mother's ladies-in-waiting. Lady Flora had an abdominal swelling widely assumed to be an illegitimate pregnancy by Sir John Conroy. Victoria believed the rumors. Of course, she harbored a deep dislike for Conroy and Lady Flora, which she had described as odious, due to their involvement in the Kensington system with the Duchess. Definitely made her childhood less enjoyable than the average. Although that being said, no one was having much of an enjoyable childhood back then, but hey. Lady Flora was first refused an intimate medical exam. When she finally consented in mid-February, she was shown to be a virgin. Well, that means she couldn't be pregnant. Conroy, the Hastings family, and the Conservative opposition then coordinated a press campaign accusing the Queen herself of spreading these falsehoods just out of bitterness and, frankly, just being a little bit mean to a woman who was suffering with a medical condition. Of course, the people who were not in the camp of supporting Victoria completely took the ball and absolutely ran with it. And they used this whole thing, drummed it up, to say, look how terrible she is. How can we have a queen on the throne who is so vindictive? Well, of course they would. But as for Lady Flora, the bad times were not over with her vindication. She actually died in July. The post-mortem revealed a large liver tumor, and that was what had caused the swollen abdomen. When Victoria appeared in public afterwards, she faced hisses and jeers, with some even calling her Mrs. Melbourne. That same year, after radicals and Tories, the latter of whom Victoria detested, voted down a bill to suspend the Jamaican constitution, aimed at reducing the political power of plantation owners, opposed to anti-slavery measures, Lord Melbourne had no choice but to resign. The Queen invited the Tory Robert Peel to form a new government. At the time, it was typical for the Prime Minister to select members of the royal household, usually drawn from his own political circle. Peel expected to replace several of Victoria's bedchamber ladies, who were allied with the Whigs. However, following Melbourne's counsel, Victoria declined to remove them in what came to be called the bedchamber crisis. Unwilling to serve under those conditions, Peel stepped aside, allowing for Melbourne to make his triumphant return as Prime Minister. You can imagine he would have felt a little bit good about that. Now who's laughing? Despite tension over the Kensington system and her mother's ongoing reliance on Conroy, social norms dictated that as an unmarried woman, even though she was the Queen, Victoria had to reside with the Duchess. Consequently, her mother was housed in a secluded suite at Buckingham Palace where Victoria seldom visited her. Melbourne acknowledged Victoria's complaints that proximity to her mother would bring, quote, torment for many years. But marriage, they joked, would be a shocking alternative. Though she resisted any push to hasten her wedding, Victoria did show an interest in Prince Albert's preparation for the role he was expected to fill as her future husband. Following Prince Albert's second visit, in October of 1839, Victoria continued to praise his qualities. Only 5 days after he had arrived at Windsor, on October 15, 1839, she proposed to him once their mutual affection became clear. They were married February 10th, 1840, in the Chapel Royal at St. James's Palace, London. Although Victoria apparently ended up with a headache that evening and had to rest, which is a shame on the wedding night, she wrote ecstatically in her journal that she had never experienced such a night before. She wrote about Albert's excessive love and affection, which gave her a sense of heavenly love and happiness that she had never imagined. They embraced repeatedly in public, and she was overwhelmed by his attractiveness, sweetness, and gentleness. Being called by tender names for the first time in her life, she wrote in her diary, felt like bliss beyond belief, and it was the happiest day that she ever had. No, just as a wedding should be. Congratulations. During the early phase of her reign, Albert gradually replaced Lord Melbourne as Victoria's closest companion and key advisor. Soon after the wedding, Victoria's mother was obliged to move out of the palace to Ingestra House in Belgrave Square. When Princess Augusta, Victoria's aunt, died in 1840, Clarence House and Frogmore House were granted to the Duchess. Thanks to Albert's mediation, mother and daughter began mending their strained relationship. And a few months into their marriage, while Victoria was pregnant for the first time in 1840, an 18-year-old named Edward Oxford attempted to assassinate her. As the Queen and Prince Albert travelled by carriage to visit her mother, Oxford fired twice, though later he claimed there was no shot in the weapons. Tried, of course, for high treason, he was declared not guilty due to insanity, and he was committed to an asylum indefinitely, subsequently sent to Australia. What a punishment that is. Public sympathy toward Victoria soared, easing the lingering negative sentiment from earlier scandals. On November 21st, 1840, she gave birth to her daughter Victoria. The Queen, however, disliked pregnancy, found newborns to be unattractive, and abhorred breastfeeding. Over the next 17 years, she and Albert had 8 more children. She couldn't have disliked it that much. Now, maybe it's the pregnancy part that she dislikes. Well, these children were Albert, Edward, Alice, Alfred, Helena, Louis, Arthur, Leopold, and Beatrice. Oh, excuse me, that's Albert Edward, rather, the first one. 8 in total. The Baroness Louise Letzen of Hanover, Victoria's former governess and steadfast supporter against the Kensington system, oversaw the household early on, yet Albert viewed Letzen as ineffective, arguing her poor management endangered the health of their daughter, Victoria. In 1842, after a heated dispute between Victoria and Albert, Letzen was granted a pension and effectively removed from the Queen's inner circle, ending their once close bond. John Francis pointed a pistol at Victoria too, while she was travelling in a carriage down London's Mall on May 29th, 1842. But no shots were fired. The weapon failed to discharge. As for the attacker, he got away, and Victoria drove on the very same route the next day, albeit a little faster and with an escort this time, in an effort to trick Francis into taking another shot and catch him in the act. Now, that is brave, because Victoria had basically agreed to use herself as the bait to bring out an assassin. God knows how he got away the first time. He must have been a fast runner, that's for sure. Well, Francis fired at her again, which was to be expected, but he was apprehended by plainclothes officers who were waiting for him and found guilty of high treason. John William Bean also attempted to shoot the Queen on July the 3rd, 2 days after Francis's death sentence was commuted to transportation for life. Sent to Australia as well. His acquittal in 1840, Edward Oxford believed, encouraged the attempts. Bean received an 18-month jail sentence. A similar attack occurred in 1849, when William Hamilton, an unemployed Irishman, shot Victoria's carriage as it travelled down Constitution Hill in London with a pistol loaded with powder. The Queen was hurt in 1850 when she was attacked by Robert Pate, a former army officer who may have simply been insane. Pate struck Victoria with his cane while she was in a carriage, bruising her forehead and crushing her bonnet. Pate and Hamilton received sentences of 7 years in prison, which you'd think they would have gotten longer. I mean, think about the time. We're talking 1840s, 1850s, attacking the Queen. You'd think they would get more than 7 years. Well, perhaps they were ahead of their time in the courts then. Maybe. Well, during the early years of Victoria's reign, Melbourne's support in the House of Commons declined, and the Whigs lost the general election in 1841. The ladies of the bedchamber most closely associated with the Whigs were replaced when Peel was appointed Prime Minister. In 1845, Ireland had its own problems. Can you guess? Yes, it was the potato blight. Terrible. It became known as the Great Famine. More than 1 million Irish starved to death over the course of the following years, and another 1 million simply left. Victoria was actually known as the Famine Queen in Ireland, so you can probably tell how they thought about it. More than any other individual famine relief donor, however, she gave £2,000, roughly 8.5 million in 2020 money, to the British Relief Organisation in January of 1847. She also backed the Maynooth grant to a Roman Catholic seminary in Ireland in spite of Protestant opposition. Yes, do remember there is the consistent conflicts between Protestants and Catholics. We will get into more of that in the modern era. It was a myth created at the end of the 19th century that she gave just £5 in aid to the Irish and the same amount to Battersea Dogs Home on the same day. Now, this, of course, these rumours got back to Ireland and probably used by a lot of Catholic nationalists to sway opinion against the English side of things. The repeal of the Corn Laws passed presented a crisis for Peel's ministry in 1846. Peel, some Tories, the free trade-oriented liberal conservative Peelites, as they were called, the majority of the Whigs and Victoria supported the appeal, while many Tories, by then also known as Conservatives, were against it. Following the repeal's narrow passage, Peel resigned in 1846 and was succeeded by Lord John Russell. Now, turning to a more global scale, Victoria was very interested in the strengthening of France-Britain ties. The British royal family and the House of Orleans, who were related by marriage to the Coburgs, visited her on multiple occasions. She was the first British or English monarch to visit a French monarch since Henry VIII of England and Francis I of France met on the field of the Cloth of Gold in 1520, and she and Albert stayed with King Louis-Philippe I at Château d'Eau in Normandy in 1843 and 45. Louis-Philippe became the first French king to visit a British sovereign when he made a reciprocal visit in 1844. Following his overthrow in the 1848 revolutions, Louis-Philippe fled to England and lived in exile. Victoria and her family fled London for the safety of Osborne House, a private estate on the Isle of Wight that they had bought in 1845 and renovated. During the height of the British Revolutionary Scare in April of 1848, the Irish nationalist and Chartist demonstrations did not garner much support at this time, and the scare subsided without any significant disruptions. Although Victoria's first trip to Ireland in 1849 was a success in terms of public relations, it didn't really do much to stem the effect of Irish nationalism. Nothing really could. Despite being Whig, the Queen did not approve of Russell's ministry. Lord Palmerston, the Foreign Secretary, frequently took decisions without first consulting the Queen, the Prime Minister, or the Cabinet. Of course, the Queen did not appreciate that very much. Despite Victoria's repeated protests, Palmerston was kept in office and continued to act independently. She complained to Russell that Palmerston had sent official dispatches to foreign leaders without her knowledge. Palmerston wasn't dismissed until 1851, when he declared, without first consulting the Prime Minister, that the British government had approved of President Louis Napoleon Bonaparte's coup in France. A short-lived minority government, headed by Lord Derby, had replaced Russell's administration by the time President Bonaparte was proclaimed Emperor Napoleon III the following year. Leopold, Victoria's eighth child, was born in 1853, thanks to the new anesthetic chloroform. Certainly helps. Despite opposition from members of the medical community who believed it to be dangerous, and members of the clergy who believed it to be against biblical teaching, she used it again in 1857, when her final child, Beatrice, was born, because she was so impressed by the relief it provided from the pain of childbirth. After many of her pregnancies, Victoria might have experienced postpartum depression. Albert occasionally laments Victoria's lack of self-control in letters. Albert, for instance, wrote to Victoria about her continuance of hysterics over a miserable trifle, approximately 1 month over Leopold's birth. Lord Aberdeen's government, which had taken Derby's place, collapsed in 1855 amid accusations of mishandling British troops during the Crimean War. Both Russell and Derby were approached by Victoria to form a ministry, but neither received enough support. So Palmerston was appointed Prime Minister. In April 1855, Napoleon III, Britain's closest ally following the Crimean War, paid a visit to London. Victoria and Albert then returned the favour from August 17th to 28th of the same year. After meeting the couple at Boulogne, Napoleon III escorted them to Paris. In addition to visiting Napoleon I's tomb at Les Invalides, whose remains had only been returned there in 1840, by the way, and the Exposition Universelle, a follow-up to Albert's 1851 idea of the Great Expedition, there were honoured guests at a ball at the Palace of Versailles that drew over 1,200 guests. It was the first visit to Paris by a reigning British monarch in over 400 years, so obviously that's a pretty big deal, don't you think? But it wasn't all fun and games. One Felice Orsini, an Italian refugee, tried to kill Napoleon, the third rather, don't get confused, on January 14th, 1858, using an English-made bomb. Palmerston resigned as the government became unstable due to the ensuing diplomatic crisis. Derby's position as Prime Minister was restored. Napoleon III sought to reassure Britain that his military preparations were focused elsewhere, and Victoria and Albert attended the opening of a new basin at the French military port of Cherbourg on August 5, 1858. Victoria chastised Derby in a letter upon her return for the Royal Navy's subpar condition when compared to the French Navy. Palmerston was called back to office by Victoria in June 1859, when Derby's ministry did not last that long. Victoria's eldest daughter married Prince Frederick William of Prussia in London 11 days after Orsini was assassinated in France. Since September 1855, when Princess Victoria was 14 years old, they had already been engaged. However, the Queen and her husband Albert postponed the wedding until the bride was 17. Albert and the Queen had hoped that their son-in-law and daughter would be liberals in expanding the Prussian state. In one of her many letters to Princess Victoria, the Queen wrote, "It makes me shudder when I look around for your sweet, happy, unconscious sisters. I think I must give them up too, one by one." The Queen wrote that she was sick at heart to see her daughter leave England for Germany. Nearly a year later, the princess gave birth to Wilhelm, the last German emperor, and the Queen's first grandchild. Victoria was present when her mother passed away in March of 1861. She was devastated when she learned from reading her mother's documents that her mother had loved her very much. Of course, remember, she wasn't really keen on seeing her mother or spending time with her. Yes, not good. She accused Conroy and Letzen of wickedly separating her from her mother. Although Albert had chronic stomach problems, he took on most of his wife's responsibilities to help her through this intense and profound grief. Victoria and Albert spent a few days vacationing in Killarney in August while their son, Albert Edward, the Prince of Wales, was attending army manoeuvres close to Dublin. In November, rumours circulated that Albert's son had slept with an Irish actress. Outraged, he went to face his son in Cambridge, where he was a student. Albert's health had deteriorated significantly by early December. William Jenner diagnosed him with typhoid. Yeah, that's a low survival rate for typhoid. So he passed away on December 14th, 1861. Poor old Victoria was heartbroken. She attributed her husband's passing to concerns about the Prince of Wales' infidelity. She claimed that he had been killed by that dreadful business. Too much stress to handle. For the rest of her life she wore black and went into mourning. You always see the pictures of her wearing only black, remember, at least after this event. It's quite sad. In the ensuing years, she stayed out of the spotlight, and she hardly visited London. She became known as the Widow of Windsor due to her isolation. Comfort eating contributed to her weight gain, which exacerbated her dislike of public appearances. Because of Victoria's self-imposed social exclusion, the monarchy's popularity declined, and the Republican movement gained momentum. Although she did not carry out her official government duties, she opted to stay isolated in her royal homes, Windsor Castle, Osborne House, and Balmoral Castle, a private estate in Scotland that she and Albert had purchased in 1847. A protester posted a notice saying that these commanding premises to be let or sold in consequence of the late occupants' declining business on the railings of Buckingham Palace in March of 1864. In another letter, her uncle Leopold encouraged her to make public appearances. She consented to drive through London in an open carriage and visit the Royal Horticultural Society's gardens at Kensington. But she became more and more dependent on a Scottish manservant named John Brown during the 1860s. In print, there were rumors of a love affair and even a covert marriage, and the Queen was called Mrs. Brown by some. Actually made a movie about it. Mid-90s, I think it was. It was called Miss Brown. It focused on the story of that relationship. I've not seen it, but I've heard of it. Well, following the Russells' brief ministry following Palmerston's death in 1865, Derby regained its position of authority. For the first time since Albert's passing, Victoria went to the state opening of Parliament in 1866. Although she opposed voting for women, she did support the passage of the Reform Act in 1867, the following year, which doubled the electorate, by granting the right to vote to many urban working men. In 1868, Derby resigned, and Benjamin Disraeli, who won Victoria over, took his place. The words, "We authors, ma'am," were used to compliment her. He had said, "Everyone likes flattery, and when you come to royalty, you should lay it on with a trowel." After just a few months in office, Disraeli's Liberal opponent, William Ewart Gladstone, was named Prime Minister at the end of the year. Victoria reportedly complained that Gladstone treated her like a public meeting rather than a woman, and she didn't like his mannerisms. After the Third French Republic was established in 1870, the Queen's isolation fueled Republican sentiment in Britain. Radical MPs spoke out against Victoria, and a Republican rally in Trafalgar Square called for her removal. She suffered a severe case of an abscess in her arm in August and September of 1871, which Joseph Lister successfully lanced and treated with his novel antiseptic carbolic acid spray. Lucky he was there. Typhoid fever, the illness thought to have killed his father, struck the Prince of Wales in late November 1871, at the height of the Republican movement, and Victoria feared her son would perish also. Her son's condition did not improve at the 10th anniversary of her husband's passing drawing near, and Victoria's anguish persisted. He recovered, though, to widespread joy. On February 27th, 1872, Republican sentiment diminished after the mother and son attended a public procession through London and a lavish Thanksgiving service in St. Paul's Cathedral. Arthur O'Connor, a 17-year-old great-nephew of an Irish MP, Fergus O'Connor, waved an unloaded pistol at Victoria's open carriage shortly after she arrived at Buckingham Palace on the final day of February 1872, 2 days after Thanksgiving service. After Brown, who was at the Queen's party, grabbed him, O'Connor received a 12-month jail sentence and birching. The incident led to a further recovery in Victoria's popularity. It seems like people are getting off very, very easy for this sort of stuff. Well, the British East India Company, which had controlled a large portion of India, was disbanded following the Indian Rebellion in 1857, and Britain's protectorates and possessions on the Indian subcontinent were formally absorbed into the British Empire. The Queen denounced atrocities on both sides of the conflict and held a comparatively balanced opinion. Albert encouraged her to write about her feelings of horror and regret at the result of this bloody civil war, and to insist that an official declaration announcing the company's handover of power of state should breathe feelings of generosity, benevolence, and religious tolerance. A clause that threatened the undermining of native religions and customs was changed to one that guaranteed religious freedom at her personal request. Disraeli regained power in the general election of 1874. Victoria firmly backed his passage of the public worship regulation in 1874, which eliminated Catholic rites from the Anglican liturgy. In her opinion, she was more in line with the Presbyterian Church of Scotland than the Episcopal Church of England, and she favoured brief and straightforward services. She also assumed the title of Empress of India on May 1st, 1876, after Disraeli successfully pushed the Royal Titles Act 1876 through Parliament. On January 1st, 1877, the Delhi Durbar announced the new title officially. Victoria's second daughter, Alice, who had married Louis of Hesse, passed away in Darmstadt from diphtheria, December 14th, 1878. Funnily enough, the anniversary of Albert's passing. The dates coincidence was described as almost incredible and most mysterious by Victoria. In May of 1879, she celebrated her 60th birthday and became a great-grandmother when Princess Feodora of Saxe-Meiningen was born. The loss of her child, though, made her feel aged. She wasn't very keen on celebrating. Probably hardly touched her birthday cake, too, one can imagine. She urged Disraeli to act against Russia during the Russo-Turkish War by threatening to abdicate 5 times between April 1877 and February 78, but her threats had no effect on the events, or had they ended with the Congress of Berlin. Victoria supported Disraeli's expansionist foreign policy, which resulted in wars like the Second Anglo-African War and the Anglo-Zulu War. She wrote, "If we are to maintain our position as a first-rate power, we must be prepared for attacks and wars, somewhere or other, continually." Victoria reviewed the British Empire's growth as benevolent and civilizing, shielding indigenous populations from the more violent nations or cruel rulers. She further wrote, "It is not in our custom to annex countries unless we are obliged and forced to do so." Gladstone returned as Prime Minister after Disraeli lost the 1880 election, much to Victoria's dismay because she was not keen on him. She was blinded by fast-falling tears, as she wrote, when Disraeli passed away the following year, and a memorial tablet was placed by his grateful sovereign and friend, Victoria. As the Queen's carriage departed Windsor railway station, March 2nd, 1882, Roderick Maclean, a disgruntled poet who was reportedly offended by Victoria's rejection of one of his poems, fired a gun at her. Gordon Chesney Wilson and another Eton College student hit him with their umbrellas until a policeman dragged him away. But once again, he got off because he was found not guilty due to insanity. But Victoria was furious at this. But she was all too happy to see the displays of loyalty following the attack, as she declared it was worth being shot at, to see how much one is loved. After falling down some stairs at Windsor on March 17, 1883, Victoria was rendered lame until July. She never fully recovered, and suffered from rheumatism ever since. 10 days after the accident, John Brown also passed away, and Victoria started writing a eulogistic biography of him, much to the dismay of Sir Henry Ponsonby, her private secretary. Having seen earlier drafts, Ponsonby and Randall Davidson, the Dean of Windsor, counselled Victoria against publishing, arguing that it would fuel rumours of a romantic relationship. They destroyed the manuscript. Victoria did follow up on her first book, though, More Leaves from a Journal of a Life in the Highlands, which she dedicated to her devoted personal attendant and faithful friend, John Brown. At the beginning of 1884, it was all complete. She received a telegram that her youngest son, Leopold, had passed away in Cannes on the day of the first anniversary of John's passing. Once again, another coincidence, and she bemoaned that he was the dearest of my dear sons. At the wedding of Victoria's granddaughter, Princess Victoria of Hesse, and by Rhine to Henry's brother, Prince Louis of Battenberg, the following month, Beatrice, Victoria's youngest child, met and fell in love with Prince Henry of Battenberg. At first, Victoria opposed the match between Beatrice and Henry, preferring to keep Beatrice at home to serve as her companion. After a year, their pledge to continue living and taking care of her won her over to the marriage. Gladstone's resignation in 1885, following the defeat of his budget, pleased Victoria. She accused him of being responsible for General Gordon's death during the siege of Khartoum, and called his administration, I quote, "the worst I have ever had." Lord Salisbury replaced Gladstone. However, Gladstone, whom Victoria described as half-crazy and really in many ways ridiculous old man, tell us what you really think, had to be remembered during the brief tenure of Salisbury's government. To Victoria's delight, Gladstone's attempt to pass a bill giving Ireland Home Rule was unsuccessful. Gladstone's party lost to Salisbury in the subsequent election, and the government changed hands once more. Victoria's Golden Jubilee was commemorated by the British Empire in 1887. On June the 20th, she hosted a banquet to commemorate the 50th anniversary of her accession, inviting 50 kings and princes to attend. She attended a Thanksgiving service in Westminster Abbey the next day and took part in a procession. She was once again very popular at this point. Abdul Karim was one of the 2 Indian Muslims that she hired as waiters on June 23rd, 2 days later. Soon after, he was promoted to Munshi and began teaching her Urdu while working as a clerk. Her retainers and family were horrified and accused Abdul Karim of biasing the Queen against Hindus and spying for the Muslim Patriotic League. But Victoria dismissed the complaints as merely racial prejudice. Equerry Frederick Ponsonby, the son of Sir Henry, found out that Munshi had lied about his patronage and told Lord Elgin, Viceroy of India, quote, "The Munshi occupies very much the same position as John Brown used to." Now, think about that quote. Remember the rumours. Now, John Brown did have his official position, sure, but apparently he was occupying a few other positions too. So yes, a bit of a scandalous thing to say. Well, after the Queen had passed away, Abdul Karim did continue to work for her until he was granted a pension, and eventually he left for India. In 1888, Victoria's eldest daughter became the Empress Consort to Germany, but she was widowed a little more than 3 months later, and her eldest grandchild, Wilhelm II, became the German Emperor. With Wilhelm's strong belief in autocracy, Victoria and Albert's dreams of a liberal Germany would simply not come true. Victoria believed that he had little heart of Zargaful, and his conscience and intellect might have been completely warped. Gladstone, who was then 82, came back to power following the general election in 1892. He reluctantly agreed not to appoint Henry Labouchere, Radical MP, to cabinet after Victoria personally objected. But he then retired 2 years later, and Victoria named Lord Rosebery Prime Minister without first consulting the departing leader. Because of the weakness of his government, Lord Salisbury took over the following year. For the rest of Victoria's reign, Salisbury continued to serve as Prime Minister. She took over her grandfather, George III, as British monarch with the longest reign on September 23, 1896. The Queen asked that any special festivities be postponed until 1897 in order to commemorate her Diamond Jubilee, which was declared a British Empire festival at the recommendation of Joseph Chamberlain, the colonial secretary. For the celebrations, the prime ministers of each independent dominions were invited to London. The dominions' prime ministers were invited, but foreign heads of state were left out, mainly in part to avoid having to invite Victoria's grandson Wilhelm II, who was thought to be a potential troublemaker. Few too many drinks at the party, perhaps. The Queen's Diamond Jubilee procession, which took place on June 22, 1897, featured troops from all over the Empire and travelled 6 miles through London. Victoria sat in her open carriage during the procession's pause for an outdoor Thanksgiving service at St. Paul's Cathedral, saving her from having to ascend the stairs to enter the structure. Huge crowds of people watched the celebration, and the 78-year-old Queen received widespread love. Victoria frequently took vacations in Europe's mainland after this. She became the first British reigning monarch to cross the border into Spain for a brief visit in 1899. By April 1900, her yearly trip to France seemed unwise because the Boer War was so unpopular in mainland Europe. Rather in part to recognize the role played by the Irish regiments in the South African War, the Queen visited Ireland for the first time since 1861. Alfred, Victoria's second son, then passed away in July of 1900. She wrote in her journal, "Oh God, my poor darling Alfie, gone too. It is a horrible year, nothing but sadness and horrors of one kind or another." Victoria celebrated Christmas 1900 at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, as she had done all through her widowhood. Her eyesight was by this point impaired by cataracts, and she was disabled by rheumatism in her legs. She was weak and unwell to the beginning of January, and drowsy, dazed, and confused by the middle of the month. As a final request, her favorite Pomeranian pet, Turi, was placed on her bed. In front of her eldest son, Albert Edward, and grandson, Wilhelm II, she passed away, age 81, January 22, 1901, at 6:30 in the evening. Albert Edward succeeded her as Edward VII right away. And with that, the life of Victoria ends. Rest in peace, Your Majesty. So, I will thank my top-tier supporters, patrons. Thank you very much for supporting the channel. Doug, Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Legitmus, Kerry, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfred Near, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Stark Factory, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Video Man, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, and the HMS HH. Thank you very much. And if you've enjoyed it, you best give a like and subscribe then, Don't you think? As for me, I think it's time to say good night and lots of love to you all.